Think about the most important decision you have ever made in your entire life. Not the easiest one, not the one that got the most applause. The one that you made in a single moment, quietly, without fanfare, and then had to live with for the rest of your days. Now imagine making that decision at 20 years old, in a foreign country, in a world where women were given exactly two choices: marry well or disappear into obscurity. Imagine making it while two of the most powerful men in England were both watching, both waiting, both wanting the answer to go their way. And imagine, after you made that choice, after you gave your answer and walked down that aisle and spoke those vows, that the man you did not choose never moved on, never stopped watching, never stopped waiting. For 30 years. He was a duke, and one of the most powerful men in England, a man who had never been told no by anyone, by Parliament, by rivals, by the institutions that shaped the world he lived in. But she had told him no, not cruelly, not carelessly. She had simply chosen someone else, his brother. And on that morning, standing in the shadow of the church where that choice was being made permanent and irrevocable, he had come anyway. Because some men, no matter how much power they carry, cannot stay away from the thing they cannot have. And some stories, no matter how carefully they are buried, refuse to stay buried. This is one of those stories. Stay with me. Before we go any further, I want you to hold 3 questions in your mind, because everything that follows is going to try to answer them. And by the time we reach the end of this story, I promise you, so the answers are going to be far more complicated than anything you are expecting right now. The first question is this: when a woman chooses between 2 brothers, one with more power, one with more warmth, and she chooses warmth, is that a decision, or is it a kind of quiet, lifelong gamble? The second question: when a man of enormous influence and pride refuses to accept the outcome of that decision, when he stays close, stays generous, stays present for 30 years in the life of the woman who chose his brother, is that love? Or is it something else entirely? Something that wears the costume of love, but moves with the patience of a man who has decided the time and power are on his side. Aaron, the third question, the one that will hit you hardest when you finally understand it, is this: did the brother she married know the whole time? And if he did, what does it say about him that he never once said a word? 3 questions, 1 story, and we are just getting started. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos on Hidden Crown Stories. To understand what happened between these 3 people, you have to understand the world they were born into. And that world, in the world of the British aristocracy in the mid-1800s, was not a world that left much room for error or emotion or the kind of messy, inconvenient feelings that refused to follow the rules written for them. England in the 1850s was a country organized around inheritance. Everything, your name, your land, your money, your place at the dinner table, your seat in Parliament, even the size of the church pew your family occupied on Sunday, was determined by birth. The eldest son got everything: the title, the estate, the financial foundation that made a family in the eyes of English society. The younger sons got a name, an expectation of loyalty to their older brother, and the understanding that their lives would be lived in the long shadow of the one who came first. This is not a metaphor. This is the literal, legal, documented structure of how English aristocratic families operated. It was called primogeniture, and it was as close to a law of nature as Victorian England ever came. Immovable, impersonal, and utterly indifferent to the feelings of the people it sorted. This is the world into which Edward Hartwell was born. The eldest son of one of the most prominent aristocratic families in England, Edward came into the world already carrying a weight that most men would spend a lifetime trying to earn. He didn't have to earn it. He simply arrived, and the weight was already his. By the time he was 25, he was being spoken of in the highest political circles as a man of unusual steadiness. A man whose judgment was trusted, whose word once given was iron. He was not the most dashing figure in any room, He was not the most charming, but he was the one that serious men turned to when they needed a serious answer. And in a world built on serious men and serious answers that counted for everything. People who observed him during those early years noted the same quality again and again in their private letters and diaries. That Edward Hartwell gave you the impression, when he was with you, that he had considered your situation fully before you finished explaining it. That he saw the whole board before most people had located the pieces. It was a quality that made him invaluable in government and very difficult in personal life to get close to. You could admire Edward Hartwell from almost any distance. Getting near him was a different matter entirely. His younger brother, George Hartwell, was cut from a different cloth. Not lesser cloth, just different. Where Edward was controlled and measured and slightly difficult to reach, George was warm. Openly, genuinely warm. The kind of man who remembered the name of the groundskeeper's youngest son, who laughed easily, who made people feel, in his presence, that they mattered in a way that went beyond their usefulness. George was liked in a way that Edward was respected, and the difference between those two things, in that world at that time, was larger than it might appear. Edward had the title, George had the room, and for years that arrangement seemed to suit them both well enough. George did not seem to carry resentment about his position as the younger son, at least not visibly. He moved through the world with a lightness that his brother simply did not possess, a quality that some people mistook for lack of seriousness and others, the wiser ones, none understood as something rarer. The ability to be fully present in whatever moment you were actually living, rather than always managing the moment toward some future outcome. The trouble, as it usually does, arrived in the form of a woman. Her name was Louise Vane. She was born in Hanover, Germany in 1832, the daughter of a German count, a family of noble blood but modest English connection. She came to London in her early 20s, as many young aristocratic women from the continent did in that era, moving through the drawing rooms and country house parties and carefully managed social events of the English season, which was less a social calendar and more a marriage market dressed in evening clothes. Louise was 20 years old when she arrived in English society, and she arrived with qualities that immediately set her apart from the women around her. She was beautiful, but beauty was common in those rooms. What was uncommon was her mind. She spoke 4 languages. She had opinions about politics, and she was not embarrassed to have them. She was witty in a way that was not performative, the kind of wit that came from actually paying attention to the world, rather than rehearsing it at the dressing table before a party. In an era when women were expected to decorate a room rather than enliven it, Louise Vane had an unfortunate tendency to enliven every room she entered, and that, as it happened, was exactly what drew 2 brothers to her at almost exactly the same moment. The year was 1852, and the setting was a country house party in Derbyshire, the kind of sprawling weekend gathering that the English aristocracy used as a sorting mechanism, a way of placing the right people in the same rooms with one another under the guise of leisure. There were hunting parties in the morning and dinners that lasted for hours in the evening, and long walks across the grounds in the afternoon, where the real business of the season, alliances, courtships, connections, was conducted in the language of seemingly casual conversation. Edward Hartwell was there. So was his brother George, and so was Louise Vane. The moment Edward saw her, something shifted in him, something that men of his discipline and training were not supposed to allow to shift. He watched her from across a dinner table debate the relative merits of 2 political positions with a man who held a senior cabinet role, watched her hold her own not by charm but by argument, and felt something he had very rarely felt in his life. The sensation of meeting someone whose mind moved faster than his own. He was intrigued. He was cautious. Edward Hartwell was always cautious. He did not move quickly. He observed. He waited. He thought carefully about the right approach, the right moment, the right framing. He was, in this, as in all things, methodical. And that methodical caution, that one characteristic that had served him so well in politics and in business and in the management of his estates, was the thing that cost him everything, because George didn't wait. George Hartwell, younger by 3 years. I'm warm where his brother was controlled, direct where his brother was strategic, did the thing that his nature had always inclined him toward. He simply told her how he felt. Not with flowers or formal gestures or the careful architecture of a courtship designed to minimize risk. He just told her. Directly, genuinely, without rehearsal. He liked her enormously. He found her remarkable. He would very much like to spend more time in her company if she was willing. It is almost impossible to overstate how unusual that kind of directness was in that world, in that era. Men of his class didn't speak like that. They implied. They maneuvered. They sent signals through intermediaries and arranged accidents of proximity and let the machinery of social convention do the work of actual feeling. George just said it, and Louise Vane, who had spent 2 years being maneuvered and implied at and managed by the very best practitioners of English aristocratic courtship, heard him say it, and it stopped her cold. She had been bracing for the chess game. She had been ready for the calculation. She was not ready for someone who simply told the truth about what he wanted. It would be wrong, and I want to be careful here, to suggest that what drew Louise to George was only the shock of his honesty. She was not a woman who made impulsive decisions. She thought about it. She weighed it, carefully and seriously, the way she did everything. George was not without standing. He was the son of one of the great aristocratic families of England, well-liked, well-connected, possessed of a warmth that she recognized after her time in English society as genuinely rare. He was not the Duke. He did not have the title or the estates or the financial scale of what Edward Hartwell represented. But Louise Vane was smart enough and self-knowing enough to understand that the question of who to spend your life with was not the same question as which title you preferred to attach to your name. She had watched enough marriages at close range by that point to know that a title on its own was not enough. She chose George. She chose warmth. She chose the man who told her the truth when the other one was still calculating the optimal moment to begin. It was, by any measure, a rational decision. It was also, as it turned out, the decision that would define the rest of her life, and the rest of Edward Hartwell's, in ways that neither of them could have predicted that summer in Derbyshire. The wedding took place in London in the summer of 1852. Louise was 20 years old. George was 23. The church was full. Their families were prominent enough that the guest list read like a directory of Victorian aristocracy. Members of Parliament, members of the House of Lords, prominent figures from the political world where both families operated. And at the back of that church, standing in the shadow of the nave, far enough from the front pews to maintain the appearance of discretion, close enough to see everything, was Edward Hartwell. He had come. He had told himself almost certainly that he was there because the wedding of his younger brother was an event he was expected to attend. He had told himself it was a matter of family duty, of social obligation, of the proper order of things. But Edward Hartwell was, above almost everything else, an honest man, and somewhere beneath the justifications, he knew why he was really there. He stood at the back of that church, and he watched his brother marry the woman he had not moved fast enough to reach, and he did not flinch, and he did not break, and he smiled at exactly the right moments, and he raised a glass at the reception with exactly the right warmth, and he said exactly the right things to the bride and groom as he left. And then he went home, and that was when the 30 years began. Now, I want you to understand what I mean when I say 30 years, because it is easy to hear that phrase and think of it as simply a long time. 30 years is not just a long time. 30 years is an entire life. 30 years in the Victorian era was the span in which a man could rise from obscurity to the most powerful offices in England, build an estate, raise children, see those children into their own marriages, watch the political landscape of the country transform 2 or 3 times over. 30 years was not a waiting period. It was an existence. And Edward Hartwell lived his entire existence in the shadow of that one morning in that church, with that woman in that dress, saying those vows to his brother. He didn't collapse under it. He didn't become a ruin. He became, if anything, more disciplined, more effective, more admired by the political establishment that watched him work. He rose through government, taking on portfolios that other men refused, managing crises that would have buckled lesser figures, declining 3 separate times. Why the opportunity to become Prime Minister of England? 3 times. The offer came. 3 times he said no. His colleagues could not understand it. The press could not understand it. Historians looking back would struggle to understand it. A man of his abilities, his standing, his connections, how do you refuse the highest office in the land 3 times? But Edward Hartwell understood his own reasons, even if he never stated them publicly. He had already turned down the thing he most wanted. After that, refusing a title, even the greatest title in the land, was not difficult. There is something I want you to sit with for a moment, because I think it is one of the most important and least discussed dimensions of this story. Edward Hartwell was not just a man who happened to be powerful. He was a man who used his power, deliberately and consistently, to remain in the orbit of the woman he had lost. Think about what that actually looks like in practice. Think about the restraint it requires. Not the restraint of absence, which is relatively easy, but the restraint of controlled presence. To be at every family dinner, every estate visit, every significant occasion, and to conduct yourself with such flawless propriety that no one, not George, not Louise, not the household staff, not the political associates who watched everything, could point to a single moment and say, there it is, there is the thing he is actually feeling. That kind of sustained performance is not something most human beings are capable of. Most of us, when we want something we cannot have, either pursue it openly or remove ourselves from proximity to it. Edward Hartwell did neither. He stayed, and he was perfect at staying. And that perfection, that sustained, decades-long discipline, is either one of the most admirable things a person has ever done or one of the most quietly terrifying. I genuinely do not know which. I suspect both are true. Here is where the story gets more complicated, and I want you to stay with me through this part, because the complications are important. They are the whole point. In the years after Louise married George, Edward Hartwell did not disappear from their lives. He was family. He was the elder brother, the head of the family, the man whose standing and connections shaped the world that George and Louise lived in. It would have been strange, perhaps even suspicious, if he had simply withdrawn. So he did not withdraw. He remained present. He visited the estate that George and Louise built their life in. He attended family dinners and holiday gatherings, and the social events that aristocratic families moved through together like ships in a convoy. He was courteous to Louise. He was warm to his brother. He was in every observable way the picture of propriety. And underneath all of that propriety, quietly and without announcement, and with the patience of a man who had chosen, at a very deep level, to simply endure. He watched. He paid attention. He stayed close to the outside world, to the friends and acquaintances and political colleagues who observed Edward Hartwell during these decades. He was a confirmed bachelor by choice, a man too committed to public life, too absorbed in the great questions of political governance, to settle into domestic arrangements. But the rumors that circulated about him, and there were always rumors, because a man of his wealth and standing and persistent bachelorhood was always going to attract speculation, were never about Louise. She was family. She was his brother's wife. The idea that Edward Hartwell, of all people, the most correct and controlled and principled man in English public life, was carrying a private flame for his brother's wife across the span of 3 decades, that idea did not occur to the people who knew him, because he was too good at not showing it. He was so good at it, in fact, that there are historians who spent years studying the documentary record of this man's life and missed it entirely. Saw the letters and read them as the correspondence of a devoted brother-in-law with a genuine intellectual friendship, nothing more. I'm all right, it took a closer reading. It took the kind of attention that you only give to something when you have already begun to suspect there is more there than the surface is admitting. But the letters existed, and the letters told a different story. Edward Hartwell wrote to Louise across those 30 years with a frequency and a depth that no amount of family obligation could fully explain. The letters discussed books, He would read something and write to tell her what he thought of it and ask what she thought, and the correspondence that followed would stretch across weeks. They discussed politics. Louise, who had retained every ounce of the intellectual engagement that had drawn both brothers to her in Derbyshire, was genuinely interested in the great debates of the era. And Edward wrote to her about them with a candor that he showed almost no one else. They discussed the management of her estate when complications arose. They discussed the education of her children. They discussed philosophy and the nature of obligation, and what it meant to live a life of public duty alongside a private interior that looked nothing like the public surface. They discussed, in other words, almost everything, but never the one thing that sat at the center of it all. Never that. The letters moved carefully around the perimeter of the truth, circling it endlessly without once touching it. And Louise kept every one of them, filed, organized, bound with ribbon, stored in a locked box in her private study, the box that her husband had seen and had chosen not to ask about. And that is when I need to introduce you to the second layer of this story, the false trail that this story laid for decades before the truth began to emerge. Because in the 1860s, a new figure entered Edward Hartwell's orbit, a woman known in society as a high-ranking courtesan, famous for her beauty and her associations with some of the most powerful men in England. Edward's name was linked with hers in the gossip columns and the private letters that circulated among the aristocracy. The connection was real. He had known her, had been involved with her in the years before Louise's marriage, had provided for her generously for the rest of her life, even after their involvement ended. Society seized on this. Here was the explanation for his bachelorhood, for his apparent lack of interest in conventional marriage. He had a private life, a discreet one, of the kind that powerful Victorian men were tacitly permitted to maintain. His colleagues relaxed. The question of why Edward Hartwell never married was answered to everyone's satisfaction, everyone's except the people who had actually read the letters. And here is something worth understanding about Victorian society before we go any further, because it is directly relevant to how this story stayed hidden for as long as it did. The Victorian aristocracy was, in many ways, a world that had perfected the art of not seeing what it was inconvenient to see. The rules were elaborate and precise, and as long as the surface was maintained, as long as the correct appearances were observed, a great deal could happen beneath that surface without anyone being required to acknowledge it. And this was not hypocrisy in the simple sense. It was a social technology, a way of managing the gap between the ideals a culture publicly endorsed and the complicated, imperfect human reality that existed underneath those ideals. Edward Hartwell understood that technology perfectly. He had grown up inside it. He used it with the same mastery he brought to everything else. The letters told a different story from the rumors, because across the same years when Edward's name was being quietly linked to this other woman, the letters to Louise did not slow down. They deepened. The ones from the mid-1860s onward, the ones that historians and biographers would eventually trace through the family archives, are different in quality from the early correspondence. They are more spare, more careful. As though a man who had spent years learning to say everything without saying the one thing had finally refined his technique to its highest form. You can read those letters and feel the weight of what is not being said pressing against every sentence. The pressure of it is almost physical. He writes to her about a book, and you can hear what he really means. He writes to her about the weather, about the management of the grounds, about a political debate he has recently had, and underneath every word is the word he never writes. And she, and this is the part that will stay with you, I promise, she writes back. Every time, with the same care, with the same precision. Two people spending 30 years saying everything except the only thing that mattered. Think about what that costs. Think about the discipline that requires. Not once, not in a difficult year, not in a moment of exhaustion or grief or loneliness. Not once across 30 years of correspondence does either of them break the surface of what they have agreed without ever discussing it, not to discuss. That agreement, never spoken, never written, never formally acknowledged, is itself one of the most intimate things two people can share. The shape of the silence between them was its own kind of language. Now here is where the first major turn arrives, and I want you to brace yourself, because this is the moment the whole story changes shape. George Hartwell, the warm, direct, genuinely good man that Louise had chosen over his brother, became seriously ill in the early 1870s. His health declined gradually at first, then with increasing speed, and as it did, the architecture of their lives shifted in ways that were observable to everyone close to the family. Edward visited more frequently, not inappropriately, not in ways that anyone could point to and question. He was family. He was the elder brother. He was helping manage affairs that George could no longer manage himself. He sat with his brother through the difficult evenings when illness strips away the social performances that people use to protect themselves. And what you are left with is just two people in a room with the truth between them. He assisted with the legal and financial arrangements that a serious illness forces upon a household. He was, by every account of those who witnessed it, exactly what a good brother should be. And Louise, exhausted, frightened, at managing a household and a husband's declining health and the education of her children and the demands of the social position she occupied all simultaneously, Louise let him be there because she was tired of carrying everything alone. And Edward Hartwell had always known, better than almost anyone, how to carry things. She let herself lean on him in those months in the way that a person under sustained pressure lets themselves lean on the one structure that feels, above all others, completely solid. She did not think carefully about what that meant. She was too tired for careful thinking. She simply let it happen. And Edward, careful, controlled, 30 years practiced Edward, let it happen too, without pressing, without taking advantage, without using the opening that the situation was handing him. He was simply there, solid, consistent, the way he had always been, the way she was beginning to understand he had always intended to be. George Hartwell died in the early 1870s. He was not yet 50 years old, and the grief that followed was real, genuinely, deeply real, for Louise, for their children, for the family that had been built around his warmth and his directness and his particular quality of making people feel that they mattered. The house was different without him. Every house where a genuinely good person has lived is different when they are gone, and everyone in that household felt the difference immediately and continued to feel it for years afterward. The warmth that George had generated, not as a performance, but as a natural condition of his presence, was simply absent. An absence of that kind does not fade quickly. It announces itself in small moments. The chair at the table that nobody sits in quite the same way. The laugh that nobody else in the room can reproduce. The particular quality of attention that one specific person gave you that you realize only in its absence. You had come to depend on without knowing it. Edward attended the funeral. He stood with the family. He managed quietly and without fanfare a number of the practical matters that death forces upon the living. And then he did something that surprised almost everyone who knew him. He waited. He did not press. He did not maneuver. He simply waited. He wrote to Louise one letter in the weeks after George's death. One letter in which he said, in the careful, restrained language that had become the only language they shared, "I am here. I am not going anywhere. Whatever you need. Whenever you need it." He did not say more. He knew she would understand everything he was not saying because she had been understanding everything he was not saying for 30 years. But here is the first twist, and it is not the one you are expecting. In the months after George's death, when Edward finally allowed himself to be, in some limited and cautious way, more openly present in Louise's life, when the careful architecture of family obligation no longer needed to serve as the primary justification for his attention, Louise did not fall into the story that had been waiting for her. She did not turn to him with relief, or with the release of 30 years of suppressed feeling, or with the kind of romantic resolution that the shape of the story seems to demand. She grieved. She grieved her husband, properly and fully and without rushing through it to reach whatever came next. She was not performing grief for an audience. She was not managing her emotions in the way that a woman of her era and her position was expected to manage them, efficiently, decorously, with a return to normal social function on a reasonable timeline. She was actually genuinely in pain because she had loved George. This is the part of the story that I think is most important to understand and most easily misread. Louise Vane had not spent 30 years secretly wishing she had made a different choice. She had loved her husband. She had built a real life with him, a life that had genuine texture and meaning and value. The fact that Edward Hartwell had spent 3 decades in the periphery of that life did not diminish the life itself. The fact that he had never stopped watching did not mean that she had been waiting to be watched. These are two different stories, and they happened simultaneously, and both of them are true. When Edward came to her, carefully after a proper period had passed, with all the correctness of manner that 30 years of practice had given him, she received him with warmth. And then she asked him to leave. Not angrily, not dramatically. She simply told him, in the direct and honest language that had always been her natural register, that she needed time, that she was not yet the person she would need to have whatever conversation he had been waiting 30 years to have, or that she had loved her husband and she was still mourning him, and she required the space to do that without the weight of someone else's need pressing against the edges of her grief. Edward left. He had waited 30 years. He could wait longer. And in that waiting, in that decision to accept her terms without negotiating them, without deploying the patience that had always served him as a tool for eventual success, something changed in him. For 30 years, the waiting had been strategic, even if he had not always consciously framed it that way. Now the waiting was something else entirely. It was simply respect, the thing he had always said he felt for her, but had perhaps never fully demonstrated until this moment. And here is what I want you to notice about that. It took him 30 years, and the death of his brother, one in the direct request of the woman he loved, for Edward Hartwell to learn how to simply respect another person's timing without managing it. That is not a small thing. For a man of his intelligence and control and ambition, that might have been the hardest thing he ever did. Here is the second twist. And this one is going to require you to sit with it for a moment, because it rewrites everything that has come before. While going through her late husband's private papers, a task that fell to her in the months after his death, the long and intimate work of sorting through a lifetime of documents and correspondence, Louise found something she had not known existed, a collection of letters, written in George's hand, addressed all of them to his brother Edward, never sent, never delivered, on a private correspondence that George Hartwell had been maintaining with himself across 30 years, addressed to the one person he had never said any of it to directly. In those letters, unsent, preserved in a locked drawer that Louise opened with a small key she found tucked inside the cover of a book on his desk, George said everything he had never said aloud. He wrote that he knew. He had always known. He had seen the way Edward looked at Louise at that dinner in Derbyshire in 1852. He had seen it and made a decision, consciously and with full awareness of what he was doing, to move before his brother did. Not out of cruelty, not out of rivalry or spite, or the desire to take something that his brother wanted. Out of the simple, honest knowledge that he loved her, genuinely, deeply, without calculation, and that if he didn't act, his brother's caution would give him the opening he needed, and the woman he loved would spend her life in a correct and admired and emotionally distant marriage to a man who had planned the whole thing like a military campaign. He chose her. He knew his brother wanted her, and he chose her anyway, and he never once regretted it, and he never once told either of them that he knew. Those last words, that he never told either of them, are the sentence that changes everything, because it means that Louise had lived her entire marriage in a situation she only half understood. She had known on some level that something existed between Edward and herself. The letters alone made that impossible to deny entirely, even to herself. But she had never known that George saw it. She had never known that the man she was married to had walked into that marriage with his eyes fully open, carrying a knowledge that he chose, every single day, to set down rather than use. In those unsent letters, George had written something in the final one. written as best as Louise could determine from the date, in the last weeks of his life, that stopped her where she sat. He had written to Edward, the brother who would never read it, that he trusted him, that of all the things he was leaving behind, the estate, the children, the life he had built, the thing he was most careful about was Louise, and he trusted Edward with her not because he felt guilty, not because he owed his brother something, but because he had watched Edward for 30 years, and whatever else he was. Edward Hartwell was a man who loved Louise Vane the way she deserved to be loved, with patience, with respect, without requiring anything in return. George had watched that love expressed quietly and correctly across 3 decades, and he had formed a judgment about the man who felt it. And that judgment was that his brother was, in the end, worthy of the one thing George had always had and Edward had always wanted. He was not releasing a debt. He was not offering a consolation prize. He was making a choice, one final act of the same directness that had defined his entire life. The man who had moved first, who had spoken first, who had loved openly and without strategy, that man, in his last weeks, made one final move. And this time, he made it not for himself, but for the 2 people he loved most in the world. Louise sat with those letters for a very long time. I want you to imagine what it means to read something like that, to hold in your hands the evidence that the man you loved and grieved knew the entire architecture of your life more completely than you knew it yourself, that he had seen the thing you had perhaps half seen and never allowed yourself to look at directly, and had chosen in his wisdom and his warmth to say nothing about it. Not because he was afraid of the answer, but because he had already decided that naming it would only damage the one thing that actually mattered: the marriage, the life, the 30 years that were real and good and worth protecting. George Hartwell had not been naive. He had not been blind. He had been, in the truest sense of the word, generous. He more generous than either of the other 2 people in this story had understood him to be. And Louise, reading those letters in the quiet of her study, with the evening light coming through the windows, understood for the first time that the man she had chosen at 20 years old, the man whose warmth had seemed to her like the simpler choice, had in fact been the most complex and the most knowing person in the entire story. She had thought she was choosing warmth over strategy. She had actually been choosing the deepest strategist of the 3, a man whose strategy was simply to love people completely and trust that love to hold. There is a particular quality to grief that changes when you discover that the person you are grieving knew something you did not. The grief does not diminish. If anything, it deepens, because now you are grieving not only the person, but the version of your shared life that you thought you understood, which turns out to have been richer and more deliberately constructed than you knew. Louise grieved George again, in those weeks with his letters. She grieved him differently. She grieved him as someone she had perhaps not fully seen, even after 20 years of marriage. And that second grief, the grief of recognizing that the person you loved was larger than your understanding of them, is, I would argue, one of the most profound experiences a human being can have. It is not comfortable, but it is, in its way, a form of honor. To be surprised by someone you thought you knew completely is to discover that you were loved by someone who was always more than you assumed. And when she finally wrote to Edward, a single letter, 1 page, composed weeks after she found George's letters, she did not write a love letter. She did not write the culmination of 30 years of carefully controlled feeling. She wrote to him as she had always written to him, honestly, directly, without performance. She told him what she had found. She told him what his brother had written, and she told him that she wanted to meet, to talk, in the way that they had never quite managed to talk, without the careful layering of propriety and family occasion and appropriate subject matter between them. Edward came, and what passed between them in that meeting, what was said, what was finally, after all of it, spoken aloud, no record of it exists. There are no letters describing it, no diary entries from either party. The meeting happened, and then the months that followed happened, and what the historical record shows, the documented, verifiable, actual fact of what is known about the people on whose lives this story is based, is that they married. On the 16th of August, 1892, 40 years after that summer in Derbyshire, Edward Hartwell and Louise Vane were married. She was 60 years old. He was 58. They had known each other for 4 decades. They had been in each other's lives in one form or another for 40 years. And they were given, by the arithmetic of Victorian lifespans, 16 years together before Edward's death in 1908. 16 years, after 40 of waiting. And I want to tell you something about those 16 years because this is the part that the historical record is least forthcoming about and perhaps most suggestive. By every account of the people who observed Edward Hartwell in the final decades of his life, after his marriage to Louise, after the decades of controlled waiting gave way to something more openly lived, he was different. Not unrecognizable, not transformed into a different man, but different in the way that a person is different when they have finally put down something heavy they have been carrying for a very long time. The controlled composure was still there. That never left him. It was too deep in his character to leave. But something beneath it had softened. People who had known him for decades and had always found him admirable but slightly unreachable noticed in those final years that he seemed more present, more willing to be simply in a moment rather than always managing it. His correspondence from those years, the letters he wrote to colleagues and family members and political associates, has a different quality from the correspondence that preceded his marriage. Less careful, less architectured. The man in those late letters sounds, for the first time, like someone who is not holding anything back. 16 years, after 40 of waiting. And the question that history cannot answer, the question that no letter, no biography, no archive of documents can resolve, is whether those 16 years were worth what preceded them. Whether the cost of the waiting, measured in decades of controlled longing and carefully managed proximity, was justified by what came at the end. Whether George, who gave his blessing from beyond the grave, had been right to trust his brother with the woman he loved. Whether Louise, who had loved one brother and been loved by the other for the full span of her middle life, found in those final 16 years something that answered the questions that had been accumulating since that summer in Derbyshire. I cannot tell you. The record does not say. What I can tell you is this. Louise Vane outlived Edward Hartwell by 3 years. She died in 1911 at the age of 79, and she was buried beside him. Not beside George, beside Edward. The choice she made at the very end, the choice of where to rest, was the most unambiguous statement she ever made about the architecture of the life she had lived. She is buried beside the man she did not choose in 1852. And whatever that means, whatever interpretation you place on it, whatever you believe it says about love and loyalty and the long arithmetic of a human life, it is the last sentence of a story that took 60 years to write. Now here is what I want you to think about, and I want you to really sit with this, because it is the question that this story has been building toward from the very first moment. We spend a great deal of time in our culture talking about the person who was chosen. We celebrate the love story that worked out, the marriage that happened, the relationship that society recognized and endorsed and recorded. We almost never talk about the person who was not chosen and what it means to live a life organized around that fact. Edward Hartwell was not chosen. He was the most powerful man in his world, and the woman he wanted chose his brother instead, for reasons that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with the qualities of character that power sometimes obscures. And he did not collapse. He did not retaliate. He did not use his position to make George's life smaller or Louise's life harder. He stayed. He was present. He was generous in ways that cost him something real, that required him to show up at dinners and stand at weddings and write letters about books when what he actually wanted to write about was the only thing he would never write about. And the question I want you to sit with is this. Was that nobility? Was it love in its purest and most demanding form? Or was it something that looked like love from the outside, but was, underneath, a 30-year act of will, a refusal to accept that something he wanted was no longer available to him? I do not know the answer. I am not sure Edward Hartwell knew the answer. I am not sure it matters because in the end, the outcome was the same. The woman was buried beside him. The story found its ending. And the 30 years between the beginning and the end were real, whatever name you give to what sustained them. I want to ask you something before you go, and I want you to actually think about it. Not just scroll past it, but actually sit with it for a moment. Because this story raises a question that I think most of us have some version of in our own lives. Even if the scale is different, even if the drawing rooms are replaced by offices, and the aristocratic estates are replaced by apartments, and the carriage rides are replaced by text messages that take too long to arrive, the question is about the people who wait. And we live in a world that celebrates boldness, that rewards the person who moved first, who said the thing, who took the risk and got the answer they wanted. We tell that story over and over again. We tell George's story, in other words, the story of the man who said it directly and got the girl. But we almost never tell Edward's story, the story of the person who didn't move fast enough, or didn't move at all, and then spent decades living alongside the consequence of that stillness. And I want to know, honestly, genuinely, I want to know, do you think Edward Hartwell was right to stay? Do you think the 30 years of quiet, controlled, correct presence in Louise's life was an act of love or an act of something else that we perhaps don't have a clean word for? Was it devotion? Was it stubbornness? Was it on some level narrow refusal to accept a loss that had already happened? Drop your answer in the comments. I mean it. I read every single one, and this one is going to start a real conversation down there, because I already know that some of you are going to defend Edward completely, and some of you are going to say that what he did for 30 years was not love at all, but a different kind of possession, a long and patient and entirely invisible form of it. And I want to hear both arguments, because I genuinely cannot decide myself. And here's the thing about George. Because George deserves more than he has gotten in this story, if I am honest with you. George Hartwell married the woman he loved, lived with her for 20 years. He built a life with her and raised children with her, and came to know her in all the ways that you only come to know someone through the unglamorous, unheroic, daily work of actually being together. The work of being the person who is there on the ordinary days, not just the significant ones. The person who knows how she takes her tea and what makes her laugh when nothing else can, and which worries she carries at night that she does not speak aloud in the daytime. That knowledge, the kind that only accumulates through daily proximity and daily attention, is the deepest knowledge one person can have of another. And George had it. He had it for 20 years. And he did all of that knowing, fully, consciously knowing, that his brother had wanted her. He never used that knowledge as a weapon. He never threw it at either of them in a moment of anger or fear or the kind of tired bitterness that long marriages sometimes produce. He carried it quietly, and he wrote about it in letters he never sent. And at the end of his life, he made peace with it in the most generous way imaginable. By trusting his brother with the person he loved most. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, an enormous thing. In fact, I would argue that George Hartwell, the younger brother, the one without the title, the one who got the girl and the warmth and the life and then gave it all up too early, I would argue that George was the most remarkable person in this story. But I want to know what you think. Who do you think loved Louise most? Who do you think she was most at peace with in her heart? Was it the man she chose, or the man who never stopped being there? Or is the question itself the wrong one entirely? Tell me in the comments. I want to know where you land on this. Before I let you go, I want to say one more thing about Louise, because in every version of this story that has been told, in the biographies, in the historical accounts, in the brief mentions in broader histories of the Victorian era, Louise Vane tends to function as the object around which the two brothers orbit. She is the woman they both wanted. She is the choice that was made. She is the consequence that Edward lived with and George accepted. And that framing does a real disservice to one of the most interesting people in this entire story. Louise Vane was not passive. She was not simply waiting to be chosen and then adjusting herself to whoever chose her. She made decisions, real, costly, considered decisions, at every stage of this story. She chose George when choosing Edward would have been easier in almost every practical sense. She kept 30 years of letters in a locked box that she could have destroyed at any point. She told Edward to leave when she was grieving, even though letting him stay would have been simpler. She chose, at the end, where to be buried. And that choice, in a world where women's preferences were routinely overridden by family and social expectation, was itself an act of will. Louise Vane was a woman who, across 60 years of a life that gave her very little room to act on her own terms, found ways to act on her own terms anyway. That is the thread running through this entire story that I think deserves more attention than it usually gets. The two brothers are fascinating, but she is the one who was holding the thread. And now I want to tell you what is coming next on Hidden Crown Stories. Because if this story, with its 30 years and its unsent letters and its quiet devotion and its grave that answered a 60-year-old question, if this story got under your skin, then what is coming next is going to go even deeper. The next story is about a woman who made a choice even more costly than the one Louise made. A countess who held a secret for 50 years, not from a man who loved her, but from the entire institution of the family she had married into. A secret that, when it finally came out, did not just change one marriage or one life, but rewrote the legal inheritance of an entire aristocratic line and sent 3 families into the courts for a decade. The documents exist, the letters exist, and the ending is nothing like what you are expecting. That story is coming to this channel. Make sure you are subscribed and make sure you have the bell notification turned on, because when it drops, you are going to want to be here from the very beginning. Every story we tell on Hidden Crown Stories is built the same way, from the primary sources outward, with as much depth and as much honesty as the record allows. No shortcuts, no sensationalism for its own sake. Just the stories that history tried to bury, told the way they actually happened. If that is what you are looking for, and the fact that you are still here at the end of a 63-minute journey through one of the most extraordinary private lives in Victorian England, who tells me that it probably is, then this is your channel. Subscribe. There is so much more to uncover.